These facial reconstructions helped identify victims, and they're downright creepy. In 2015, a body was discovered along the I-40 highway near Hinton, Oklahoma. The body was so badly decomposed that a forensic artist created this reconstruction hoping somebody would recognize her. She was identified over a year later, and her killer pleaded guilty in 2017 and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. In 1994, a hiker stumbled across a skull near Windy Point, Colorado. These reconstructions were made, but the case remained cold for nearly 30 years. She became known as Windy Point Jane Doe. It wasn't until March of this year that she was identified as Susan Hobbs of Washington State. This reconstruction was done on a body that was found in Salem, New Hampshire in August of 1968. The unidentified body had 4 gunshot wounds. It wasn't until 2019 when John Doe was identified as Vermont resident Winston Morris.
Do you remember the story of the adult woman who was pretending to be a child in order to get adopted? Well, the story is so much crazier than that. In 2010, the Barnett family adopted Natalia Grace, a 6-year-old girl from Ukraine. But shortly after the adoption, the family claimed that Natalia wasn't who she said she was. She couldn't speak any Ukrainian, which the family thought was weird, but she was also showing signs of being post-puberty, meaning she probably wasn't 6 years old. So the parents got a bone density test done on her, and the doctor said that she was at least 14, if not older. And on top of that, her behavior was starting to become menacing. She would stand over the parents' beds at night saying she was just waiting for the right time, and she threatened violence against the 3 other sons. One time she even tried to poison the mother. But what do the parents do? They get her age legally changed to 22 years old, rent her an apartment, and leave her in it by herself. They thought they were escaping a murderer, but many believe that they abandoned a disabled child. There's so many twists and turns to this story, and I do a whole deep dive on my podcast this week.
Pictures with creepy backstories. Hotel manager pouring acid into pool because he only wanted white people to use it. Youngest mother ever recorded. At only 5 years old, she had a rare condition called precocious puberty. The father was never found. Seconds after this photo was taken, both boys were struck by lightning. This was the last photo taken of a volcanologist who moments later was killed by a volcanic eruption. The night this photo was taken of a mum and 2 sons, the son on the left paid to friends to kill her and his brother.
It's like an 8-mile city called Felicity, and it's definitely a cult. Yes,
and this really rich guy, he's a Rothschild. He bought this town of Felicity and named it after his wife, Felicity.
Wait, is this real?
Who we think we ran into.
Can we make sure that this is real? They offer tours of this place.
Oh, we did a tour.
We did a tour.
Horrifying.
Why?
They tried to get us into this cult. They put us in this pyramid. They tried to get us in the center of the pyramid, in the center of the thing, put our foot in the middle, save this thing and make a wish and then sign a contract. And I was like, and we were like, I'm not doing that. And she was like, well, it's the only part of the tour you have to do the tour. And that's when we said, we don't want to do the tour anymore. We're going to leave. And she was pissed.
And then they said, she goes, this right here is the center of the world. Once we saw it and we're like, because the staircase, you can see it from so far away, and then you see the pyramid and you're like, something is going on here.
20 cars in the parking lot, no people. There's a cop that lives there who went there to investigate what was going on and never left.
Wow.
And then he lives there now.
Normal looking photos that have a disturbing backstory.
On Christmas Day in 1929, Charlie Lawson would murder his wife, 6 of his 7 children, and take his own life. This photo shows a nice, large family vacationing in Sweden in the 70s. The kid in the brown shirt, however, is a 14-year-old boy named Osama. Years later, Osama bin Laden founded the pan-Islamic militant group Al-Qaeda and was responsible for the 9/11 attacks.
This is the last known photo ever taken of comedian Robin Williams. It was captured October 8th, 2014, just 1 day before he took his own life. This rare picture shows a man playing with kids in his neighborhood. If you don't recognize him, this is one of America's most infamous serial killers, Ted Bundy. This photo shows Michael and Susan Kuhnhausen after being married for 18 years. In 2006, Michael hired a hitman to kill his wife. However, Susan choked the man with her bare hands, saying, "Tell me who sent you here, and I'll call you an ambulance."
Normal-looking photos that have a disturbing backstory, Part 28. While this appears to be a book with typical wear and tear, the damage at the bottom is from a bullet hole. The math book belongs to 10-year-old Uzziah Garcia, who along with 18 other students died in the Robb Elementary School shooting that occurred just a few months ago. This mirror selfie shows Giovanni Bezerra, a Brazilian anesthetist, who was arrested after assaulting a pregnant woman during her C-section. He heavily sedated her and placed his private part in her mouth for 10 minutes, and is seen in a hidden camera wiping her face with gauze after he was done. This photo shows a group of US airmen who were taken as prisoners of war by Japanese soldiers in 1945. 8 of the 11 men were dissected while they were still alive, and the 3 others were placed in custody. This photo shows Michael and Susan Kuhnhausen after being married for 18 years. In 2006, Michael hired a hitman to kill his wife. However, Susan choked the man with her bare hand, saying, "Tell me who sent you here, and I'll call you an ambulance." This footage shows a man named Luca Magnotta auditioning for a reality TV show years before he would publish 2 dark videos that would shock the internet forever. The first was uploaded in 2010 with the title, "One Boy, 2 Kittens," showing a man petting his 2 cats while playing Christmas music in the background. Later in the video, Luca, who doesn't show his face, can be seen suffocating the animals in a plastic bag using a vacuum cleaner. Viewers were deeply disturbed, and people spent months trying to track down the user who uploaded the video. However, Luca remained anonymous for 2 years until May 25th, 2012. He uploads a second video entitled, "One Guy, One Ice Pick." It shows a man bound on a bed, then there's a cut, and the man is now dead. Someone then stabs him with an ice pick and proceeds to dismember the corpse. The victim's body parts are then mailed to local schools and the offices of political parties, with the torso being found in a suitcase. Luca Magnotta is arrested shortly after, and in December 2014, is sentenced to life in prison.
Killers That Got Caught for Being Stupid, Part 3. And this is a series I've been doing, so make sure you follow along. I just felt like I had to make this video, but we're gonna talk about this guy right here. I remember when the Idaho tragedy first happened, there was this idea going around online that some criminal mastermind had done this, that it was a serial offender that was never going to get caught. When in reality, no, it was just done by this dumbass. And you could tell that he thinks he's the smartest guy ever, but we're here to knock him down a peg. For one, Brian had his phone on him the entire time he was casing the house leading up to the crime and for most of the night he committed the crime. And when the cops got his phone records, he literally drew a map of him driving straight to the crime scene that night. And the reason the cops had enough evidence to grab his phone records was he left part of the weapon he used in the house that night in a room that he locked behind him. So even if he did realize he had left it there was no way for him to retrieve it. And he walked straight past one of the surviving roommates somehow without seeing her, and she was able to give an exact description of him to the police. And the police went to go question Brian because they knew he drove a white Elantra, but the first thing they noticed was that he had the bushy eyebrows that the roommate described the person in the house having. So the next time you see a stupid photo and hear, oh, he was a PhD student, he was learning how to commit the perfect crime, no. What is some of the craziest stuff people have confessed to as they're dying? Well, in this series, I'm gonna read to you some of the craziest ones I could find. This story comes from a hospice nurse that was dealing with a patient who had fought in the Vietnam War. Early on in his treatment, she actually asked him if he had any siblings, and he mentioned that he did have a brother, but he passed away in Vietnam. He also had a wife who had previously passed away, and because of this, he didn't have a lot of people that would come visit him. The man had dementia, and the nurse said that at times it felt like he was digging deep into his brain to find moments from his life that he could describe to the nurse in vivid detail. So one night the nurse comes in, and the man is in really rough shape, like it looks like he's not going to make it through the night. And when she walks in, he starts beckoning her over, like, come here, come here, come here. So the nurse comes over, and the man begins to tell her that his brother wasn't killed by an enemy soldier in Vietnam. He had actually killed his brother. And not only that, but these men were twins. So when the brother died, the other one fully assumed his identity when he came back to the States. Meaning that when he came back from the war, he took his brother's entire life, including his wife. The man ended up passing away that night, and later on the nurse told his daughter what she had heard. And the daughter did not believe her at all, but then years later, she finds a handwritten confession from her father stuffed in a Bible.
Facts that'll eat at you for days. In 2008, Joe Matheny was sentenced to death after murdering 8 people, turning their meat into hamburgers and selling them to unsuspecting customers. This photo shows the survivors of the 1972 Andes plane crash. The passengers resorted to cannibalism to survive 72 days in the snow. If you look closely at the ground, you'll see a human spine picked clean next to the guy on the right. In 1928, Albert Fish met up with his friend with the intention of killing and eating him. However, when he was introduced to the guy's 10-year-old sister Grace, he decided to eat her instead. After, he sent a letter to their parents saying that she tasted sweet and tender. In 2008, a man on a packed Greyhound bus named Vince Lee killed and beheaded another 22-year-old passenger. He proceeded to dismember and eat his body in front of the other people on the bus. In 2001, a man named Armin Maiwis posted an ad on a website called Cannibal Cafe looking for someone to be killed and eaten. A German engineer named Bernd Brandes volunteered, and after photos and videos of the incident were posted online, Armin was sent to jail, where today, he's a vegetarian.
So this murdered Texas couple's missing baby has finally been found after 42 years. And the story is crazy. Let's take a look. So in 1981, Dean Klaus, his wife Tina Lynn, and their baby Holly disappeared without a trace in East Texas. The only clue was from an anonymous caller who said that he had found Dean's car in California. And he claimed that 3 women in white robes drove it from Texas to California. Police were actually able to track down one of the women who called herself Sister Susan, and she claimed that Dean had joined a cult and renounced all earthly possessions. And she wouldn't tell them anything else. It actually wasn't until late last year that human remains found around the same time were confirmed to be Dean and Tina's. Dean had been beaten to death and Tina had been strangled. But that didn't answer what happened to Holly. This year, investigators were searching for human remains around where Dean and Tina were found. And that's when they got a genetics hit that Holly was alive and in Oklahoma. But get this, when they were talking to Holly, they found out that she had been left on the steps of a church in Arizona by none other than 3 women in white robes. Investigation is still pending, and they are really trying to figure out who these white-robed women are. But for now, at least we know that Holly is alive and well.
5 pictures with creepy stories. Blanche Monnier, locked in an attic by her mother for 25 years without sunlight. When discovered, she was covered in old food and feces, with bugs all around the bed and floor, weighing barely 55 pounds. Jim Jones. Jim Jones receiving a Martin Luther King Jr. Humanitarian Award. A year later, he would lead his followers to the largest mass suicide in history, claiming 900 lives. The Lawson family. Taken 3 days before Christmas when Charlie Lawson, second from top right, murdered everyone in the picture, including himself with a shotgun. Final footprints. Final footprints of a 4-year-old girl that drowned in the pond pictured behind. Mark Jackson's basketball card. In the background are the Menendez brothers sitting courtside after they killed their parents.
3 BuzzFeed Unsolved cases had groundbreaking discoveries this year. You maybe remember the story of the Lady of the Dunes. In 1974, a young woman who was out for a walk in the dunes of Cape Cod discovered the body of a woman. She wasn't able to be identified because her killer actually did things to her body so that you wouldn't be able to identify her, like removing her hand so you couldn't get fingerprints. But then this year, through DNA analysis and historical records, she was able to be identified as Ruth Marie Terry. And it turns out her husband at the time, Guy Rockwell Moldovan, was a suspect in the murder of his previous wife and stepdaughter. Then there's the case of the boy in the box, where in 1957, the body of a young boy was found wrapped in a blanket inside of a box in Philadelphia. The identity of the boy remained a mystery until this week, when through DNA analysis, he was identified as Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Police credited advancements in DNA profiling as well as volunteer sleuths who were able to figure out who his potential relatives would have been. Police also say it'll be an uphill battle to determine who is responsible for his death since his parents have since passed. And last we have the Somerton man, whose death in 1948 baffled Australian police. He was an unknown man found laying against the wall on Somerton Beach with nothing on him to identify him. The tags on all of his clothes had been cut, and the autopsy came back as potential poisoning, but his identity has stumped us for decades. That is until July of this year when he was identified as Charles Webb. It said that a DNA match from a first cousin 3 times removed was what sealed the case.
Cannibal facts that'll eat at you for days. If you thought Jeffrey Dahmer was picky for not eating people with tattoos, Venezuelan serial killer Dorangel Vargas, who ate 10 people, didn't like his victims to be overweight because he thought that they contained too much cholesterol. On Thanksgiving Day 1991, 23-year-old Omaima Nelson stabbed her sugar daddy William before carving him up and cooking his head in a deep fryer and eating him for dinner. In the 1970s, Jorge Negromonte, also known as the Brazilian Sweeney Todd, would bake his victims into pies before selling them to local townsfolk. After murdering and eating his classmate in 1981, Issei Sagawa was released from prison because of a loophole in Japanese law. Since then, he's actually profited off the crime, writing books, appearing on talk shows, and starring in adult films where he bites his fellow co-stars. In 2001, a man named Armin Maiwis posted an ad on a website called Cannibal Cafe looking for someone to be killed and eaten. A German engineer named Bernd Brandes volunteered, and after photos and videos of the incident were posted online, Armin was sent to jail, where today, he's a vegetarian. In 1904, a Swedish sailor named Carl Pettersson shipwrecked on an island inhabited by cannibals. He was captured and taken to a local king whose daughter actually fell in love with him. The two then got married, had 9 kids, and Carl became the new king.
These serial killers got caught because of stupid mistakes they made. And I cover all sorts of true crime and spooky stuff here, so make sure you follow along. Dennis Rader was a prolific serial killer in Kansas from 1974 to 1991. He was called BTK, which stood for bind, torture, kill, because that's what he liked to do. But he also liked to taunt the police. He would send the police letters signed BTK, which could not be traced back to his real identity. So in the early 2000s, he had been dormant for over 10 years, but he still liked to taunt the police. And the early 2000s also brought new technology for communicating. So BTK, being the mad genius he was, wrote a letter to police asking if he sent them a floppy disk, would they be able to trace it back to him? And the police answered this letter basically saying, no, we totally can't do that. So BTK sends the police a floppy disk, and there is metadata on this floppy disk that says the last edit was done by someone named Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church. And then a 10-second Google search showed police that Dennis Rader was the president of the council at Christ Lutheran Church. Afterwards, the police basically came out and said that if Dennis had just kept his mouth shut and kept murdering, they probably would have never caught him. Let me know if you want more of these, because there's some other idiots out there.
Mom, can you just pass my drink that's on the table, please? Thanks.
These are the legs of a 13-year-old child. Swollen, yellow, and twisted, these injuries are not the result of a car crash, a sports injury, or some disease. No, these bruised, broken legs are the result of a deranged madman. He's addicted to the sound of breaking bones and loves inflicting pain on his victims. This is the story of Thaddeus Phillips, the boy who survived the Bone Breaker. Baraboo, Wisconsin, 1995. It's the night of July 29th and Thad Phillips is sound asleep. Suddenly, he feels the sensation of being lifted up, but this isn't a dream. It's the beginning of a real-life nightmare. At some point, he realizes that he's being carried through the house, and Thad, who's still half asleep and groggy out of his mind, assumes it's his dad. As he becomes more aware, Thad realizes that he is in the arms of someone he does not know. However, since the mystery man is so friendly, Thad follows him into the night about a mile away to an old rundown house. The stranger introduces himself as Joe and tells Thad that later he's going to have a party and proceeds to rattle off a few names, some of which the boy recognizes from school.
He then follows him up the broken wooden steps, having no idea he is walking into the clutches of a monster. And the moment they step inside the room, Joe, like a light switch, changes from warm and welcoming to crazed and psychotic. He then lifts up Thad and throws him onto a filthy-looking bed, straddles him, and pins his arms at his side. The boy desperately tries to break free, thrashing about wildly, but 90-pound Thad is no match for Joe, who is nearly twice his size. Joe then grabs a hold of the boy's right foot and twists it until... snap. After shattering the boy's leg, Joe lets up a bit, relaxes, and shrugs his shoulders as if to say sorry. The bone breaker continues this cycle for hours on end. And when Thad isn't being abused, Joe actually carries him around the house and they watch TV together and talk about life. And it's during one of these down times that Thad asks Joe why he's doing this to him. Joe tells him that he is fascinated with the sound of bones when they break. Joe further admits that he's actually done this before to 2 other boys. The next morning, after a few hours of watching TV together, Joe, out of nowhere, picks up injured Thad and carries him upstairs to resume brutally breaking down the young boy's body. His left ankle is grabbed and turned in the same way his right one was the day before, until it breaks. Joe then methodically coils the kid's skin until it quite literally looks like there are rubber bands wrapped around his leg, and then he proceeds to twist his foot backwards, pointing in the opposite direction. And when it's over, the boy's thrown into a closet and the door is locked. July 31st, 1996. Almost 43 hours after this unimaginable horror began, Thad is thirsty, hungry, and getting weaker by the second. He thinks that he might be bleeding internally and knows that if he doesn't escape soon, he's gonna die. Eventually, he finds a large wooden guitar and smashes it into the door over and over again until finally it breaks down. He crawls for a bit, passes out, wakes up, does this several more times until finally he reaches the front door by the kitchen. There he spots a telephone mounted on the wall. Thad dials 911 and the dispatcher traces his location and police are sent in to rescue him, and he's rushed to the hospital in critical condition. When he arrives, doctors say that he's in such bad shape that he was just within hours of passing away. His legs no longer look human. They are bruised and swollen beyond recognition. Despite his injuries, when he'd been rushed to the hospital, he'd somehow managed to tell investigators that his captor, now identified as 17-year-old Joe Clark, had in fact done this before. The House of Horrors belongs to his parents, who'd been away visiting his sister. Joe's arrested a few hours later and had been found partying at his girlfriend's house when he's taken into custody. When authorities search Joe's home, they come across something truly terrifying. Inside his bedroom, they find a notebook, and inside is a list of 24 other boys in the area. At the top of each column is a heading, showing when he planned to kidnap a boy and what he wanted to do with them. During Thad's trial, Joe admits to taking Thad, but only to hang out, and had no idea how the boy had been injured because he had quote-unquote blacked out. He pleads not guilty by reason of mental defect. However, the jury doesn't buy it, and Joe Clark is found guilty and sentenced to 100 years in prison. A man named Peter Porco hops out of bed, uses the bathroom, shaves, puts on his suit, and walks downstairs to eat breakfast. He then prepares his lunch for work that day, loads the dishwasher, writes a check for his son, and then walks outside to go get the morning newspaper. But when the door shuts behind him, he gets locked out. Luckily though, Peter has a spare key hidden in a flower pot on his front porch. He grabs it, unlocks the door, and opens it slowly just to make sure he doesn't wake up his wife, but out of nowhere, he collapses. Dead. Peter and Joan Porco are your typical modest family that live in a 2-story home in New York. They have 2 sons, John, who serves as a naval officer, and Christopher, who's a student at the University of Rochester, 200 miles away. The couple are both in their 50s and have been married for more than 30 years. Peter serves as a court clerk at the Albany courthouse and is known by his coworkers as a reliable, trustworthy guy. So when he doesn't show up for work on an important court date, everyone becomes a bit concerned. A colleague of his reaches out several times, but Peter never picks up the phone. The coworker then proceeds to drive to his home to make sure that everything is okay, but when he arrives, there's a crimson trail leading from the walkway up to the doorstep, and finally, to Peter. First responders arrive at the scene, and that's when they discover Joan Porco lying in the bed. They're shocked to see that she's alive and conscious because it's obvious she has severe head trauma and there are wounds all over her face. Afraid she won't live much longer, a detective looks at Joan and says, "Who did this to you? Do you know them?" She pauses and it's clear she's not able to make out words. She simply nods, yes. The detective then says, "Was it your son, Chris?" And again, she nods, yes. Joan is then rushed to the hospital, and after 12 hours of emergency surgery, doctors are able to save her life. However, it's clear that she's not 100%. Joan had received trauma with a blunt object 3 times to her head, causing the loss of her left eye and a fragment of her skull. It's revealed that the murder weapon is a 3-foot axe later found in the couple's bedroom. Peter's autopsy report shows that he was hit 16 times with trauma to the head, face, and body. However, the injuries, which tore off a part of Peter's jaw and exposed a part of his brain, were not the cause of his death. It was the blood loss. See, even after such catastrophic injuries, Peter was still able to get up and go about his day as though nothing happened, surviving for several hours. It's also worth noting that in the past 2 years, the Porcos had undergone 2 separate robberies where computers and electronics were stolen from the home. As detectives continue to sift through the evidence surrounding the Porco case, a news reporter makes a call to their son Chris and tells him his parents are dead. He proceeds to call 911 and see if this is actually true and tells police that he was sleeping in the lounge of his college when his mom and dad were attacked. Now keep in mind, Joan identified Chris as her attackers, so detectives start looking for reasons why he'd be motivated to kill his parents. They begin digging into his past to find that his relationship with Joan and Peter was far from perfect. And just 2 weeks before his murder, Peter Porco had confronted his son Chris about forging his name on a $46,000 check to buy a yellow Jeep Wrangler. Investigators then come across a crucial piece of information. Joan and Peter Porco have a $1 million life insurance policy, half of which is entitled to their son Chris. 3 weeks following the grisly ambush of the Porcos, Joan, who is in a medically induced coma, wakes up. And as she starts coming to, she says that she doesn't remember anything about the night of the attack, and even goes on to defend Chris, saying that her son would never do such a thing. But his mother's defense isn't enough. The evidence keeps stacking up against Chris, with surveillance cameras from his college showing a yellow Jeep leaving campus at 10:30 on the night of the attack. The vehicle returns the following morning at 8:30, and a pair of New York toll booth operators also report seeing a yellow Jeep between the time he left and returned to campus. And when students and staff are asked if they'd seen Chris on the night of his father's murder, no one reports saying that he was sleeping in the lounge of his dorm. Also, if you're still wondering how Peter was able to go about his day with a chunk taken out of his brain, I have your answer. Basically, the paleocortex, the part of the brain responsible for daily tasks, wasn't actually injured during the attack, turning Peter into a real-life zombie, able to go about his day until eventually he bled out and died. A year later, in November 2005, Chris is indicted, and his mother, who is still severely disfigured from the attack, manages to scrape together $250,000 for bail and stay with him every day, arm in arm, until his trial begins in May 2007. Prosecutors argue that from their findings, Chris had manipulated his friends at school, claiming that he was a rich kid, but in reality, he was just a con man. Not only did he regularly steal money from his parents, but he himself was responsible for the 2 burglaries at the Porco home. He'd pawned the electronics off on eBay because mom and dad had cut him off. And when they cut off Chris for a 3rd time, he, in a fit of rage, drove 300 miles in his stolen Jeep to murder his parents and frame it as though it was just a burglary that had gone wrong. The defense, on the other hand, says that no physical evidence actually ties Chris to the crime scene. However, it's this one detail that proves that Chris Porco is a cold-blooded killer. On the night of the attack, someone had used the family's 4-digit passcode to enter the home and turn off the alarm before smashing it. On May 24, 2007, Chris Porco is sentenced to 2nd-degree murder and attempted murder, being sentenced to 50 years in prison. Just how was Chris able to look his mom in her disfigured face and lie to her saying he wasn't the one who did it without feeling an ounce of remorse? A psychologist working on the trial explains this phenomenon best with one word: sociopath.